start with a prayer. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Amen. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of thy faithful, and kindle in them the fire of thy love. Send forth thy Spirit, and they shall be created.
And thou shalt renew the face of the earth.
Let us pray.
O God, who didst instruct the hearts of thy faithful by the light of the Holy Spirit, grant us in that same Spirit to be truly wise, and ever to rejoice in consolation. Through Christ our Lord. Amen.
It is September 9th, 2012. This is the fall section of the classes on the Church Fathers, the early church history. And this is a continuation of the class we started this spring. Part 1 was the Apostolic Fathers that we covered in the spring. And I have passed out a list of the charts, handouts, and texts that we used thus far in those classes. And I'll pass out a few more here from my assistant. There's some of those. Okay. And you'll see that what we covered, there's a list of charts, handouts, and texts, and it shows that we covered 9 classes in the spring. There were 3 classes that were sort of introductory classes, and then we had 6 classes on individual apostolic fathers, and we actually read as a class the text, the important early text of the apostolic fathers. The apostolic fathers is a term that means those very early fathers of the church who were contemporaries of the apostles, and they were either taught by the apostles or people who were in direct contact with the apostles. And therefore, their witness as to what the early church was about and what its doctrines and teachings were are very important for historical purposes to find out what was the nature of the early church. So it's a very crucial period of history. And what I want to do, we've been trying to videotape these classes, and we decided to do that after the first class in spring. So we've got 8 of them on videotape, but we don't have the first one. Well, the first one was pretty important because we went over the major themes that we're going to be talking about, not only in the Apostolic Fathers, but for the rest of the early church history class. And the themes apply to everything. And we kind of gave an overview. And so the videotapes as we have them right now start with class number 2. Well, class number 2 is a review of 1,000 years of history through 3 cultures and 3 languages, the Jews, the Greeks, and the Romans. Now you have this chart in your handout because I've given you all the charts that we used in the spring, the Apostolic Fathers. But if you start to listen to those tapes, you jump right in the middle of this, it doesn't make a lot of sense. So what I'm going to do today is sort of review. I'm going to talk about the major themes again. Some of you have heard this and it may bore you to tears, but many of you haven't. And I think it will help set the stage, and we will use that tape of this class will be put at the start of the tape series, including Apostolic Fathers, so it will make more sense to people who come after and look at it. If anybody should look at it, who knows? Maybe so terrible. No one. We have no audience, but it may be useful to do it this way. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to review, do 3 things basically. Number 1, I'm going to review the major themes of the course. Number 2, we're going to review briefly the Apostolic Fathers, so if you didn't take the course, we'll know what we're talking about and have some idea of how they fit in. And the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go over the outline for the fall classes and tell you about where we're going forward. When we started the class, the first thing I did is I went over some key terms that are used very often and we're going to be using throughout the history of the early church. And you have that handout, it's chart number 2, and you can look at it at your leisure. But some very important terms. There's a word, angelos. It's translated angel. It's a Greek word and it means messenger. When the Greeks would read the word, the Holy Scripture in Greek, they'd see that an angel came, it means messenger from God. Well, and the angelia is the message in Greek, and the evangelia is the good message, the good news, which is the Greek term for what we in English call the gospel. The gospel is a message, and it's a good message, and it's the thing that really the whole Catholic Church is organized around, to protect the gospel, the good news, the message. An evangelist is someone who brings the good message. It's a messenger. The word apostle, apostolos, it means a messenger. Literally, it means the one sent forth. Christ sends forth the apostles, but he sends them forth to teach all nations, carrying the message of the gospel. The church, the word for the church is ecclesia. Literally, it means the ones called forth. The messengers go out and call forth the church, and Christ calls forth the church, the ecclesia. And Catholicos is a Greek word. It means universal, Catholic, and literally it means concerning the whole entire thing. And so we have the Catholic Church that we're talking about. We also use three terms that will recur over and over. Episkopos. Episkopos is a Greek word meaning bishop. Bishop is English, and if you read the New Testament in Greek, episkopos is what we're talking about. We talk about bishops. There's another word, presbyteros, presbyter. That's the Greek word that is translated priest. So we have episkopos, presbyteros, and then we have diakonos, the deacon. Those are the three orders, the three holy orders, and we'll talk about them throughout this course. And you have that handout. I now want to turn to the major themes, and actually it's actually a two-pager. There's the second page I somehow left in my basement. There are actually 5 major themes, and you have a handout on it. It's chart number 1. The 5 major themes that we're going to be dealing with throughout this class. Number 1 is history. Number 2 is tradition. Number 3, development of doctrine. Number 4, the Bishop of Rome. And number 5, the Church in Crisis. I'll take just a minute to review those things. But maybe let me step back for a moment. We're studying history. We're studying the history of the early church. And I want to make something clear from the very outset. We're going to be covering a lot of historical concepts and names and dates and councils and fathers and heretics and creeds and all kinds of stuff like that most people don't know much about. Some people know some about. Some people know a lot about. One thing I want to make clear at the outset is knowledge of this stuff will not make you a better person, will not make you holy, and will not save you. We're talking about the intellect here, working our intellect to know things. The intellect is to know and see and understand. Well, you can be the smartest person in the world on all of this. You can have all this memorized. And if your will isn't right, you don't love the right things, do the right stuff, then you're in big trouble. Sanctity lies in the will, and that's not what this class is about. I would be a very poor teacher of that. I know very little about that. I know a little bit about the intellect. But I don't want to get the impression that, gee, we know this stuff and therefore we're better people. It's not true. You can know absolutely none of this and be a saint. And that many, many saints knew very little of this. And it didn't matter to making sense. So I want to make that clear at the outset. You're not making yourself a better, holier person by doing this. But you are working your intellect. And after all, St. Peter in his epistle says you should always be ready to defend the hope that's in you, to give reasons for it. This will help us give reasons, and it's particularly useful, I think, in this day and age, because if you go out there and read anything about early church history in the academic sources or the mainstream media, the whole thrust of it with respect to the Catholic Church is that the Catholic Church invented all this stuff at some later date. That it's not really the church that Jesus Christ founded. It's not really Jesus Christ's teachings. Instead, the narrative that you will read in many, many periodicals today is that, the power structure, the emperor, the imperial court, and the bishops all got together and cooked this stuff up later so they could control people and get rich and do various nefarious things. One thing this course, I hope, will help us do is to understand how false that view is. Because we're going to go through the early church and find out the extent to which, whether or not it reflects what we have in the Catholic Church today. Ultimately, the issue is the Catholic Church the church founded by Jesus Christ? That's ultimately the issue. If it's not, then we're probably wasting our time. If it is, then everybody ought to come to this. So that's what we're talking about in major themes. The first theme is history, and that's why we're studying history. to get at that kind of thing, and so we can defend our faith and defend it against these kinds of attacks. One of my favorite quotes is Blessed John Henry Newman, who was an Anglican, as I used to be. He was a priest in the Church of England. And he started studying the early fathers. He studied them deeply, wrote very scholarly books about them. And he wrote a book called Essay on the Development of Christian Doctrine. And he got about 3/4 of the way through and said, I've read all this. The Catholic Church is the church founded by Christ. I have to resign. I have to quit my job. He was a professor at Oxford. I have to leave all my friends. I have to join the Catholic Church. And he, in his book, Essay on the Development of Doctrine, he says, to be deep in history is to cease to be a Protestant. And we found a lot of that out as we went through the Apostolic Fathers, and we'll find out more about that. Another major theme is tradition. Tradition is a Latin word meaning hand over. In our context, it's deliver the message, the gospel. The Catholic Church is the church founded by Christ, and it's the true bearer of his message. We're going to examine that theme against the historical sources we're going to be looking at. One of my favorite quotes is from G.K. Chesterton. This is from his book called The Thing. Says, the Catholic Church is the only thing that talks as if it were the truth, as if it were a real messenger, refusing to tamper with a real message. It's one of many reasons. This is one of my favorite quotes. A lot of people, including a lot of misguided Catholics nowadays, think, well, you know, the Pope and the bishops, it's kind of like Congress. If they could change all this stuff, if they just, you know, get enlightened and they could change marriage, they could change the sacraments, they could change the priesthood. If they just, you know, if they just decided to do it and got enlightenment, they could do it with the stroke of a pen. That's not true. And it's shown throughout history. The Pope can't alter the message. He understands his office is to protect the message, not to alter it. And the bishops who understand this rightly, and thank God the vast majority of them do, understand that they are entrusted with a message. It was first entrusted to the apostles, and the apostles handed it on to their successors in the apostolic succession, the bishops, down to this very day. And they are the guardian of the message that was delivered by Jesus Christ, who Catholics proclaim as the Son of God, the second person of the Trinity, the eternal Word, the person who created everything that is and sustains it in existence. So that's a very important thing that is very misunderstood, including by a lot of Catholics. They think, well, the Pope, why don't we just change the marriage sacrament around? Like, you know, what's the big deal? And why do we keep talking about all these sins that modern people don't believe in anymore? Well, they can't alter the message, and they won't alter the message. And I was going to have, the next page is in my basement. But it's on your handout, which is one of the reasons I have these. The third one is the development of doctrine. We will see that doctrine all the doctrine, the creeds don't exist at the first earliest time of the church. They come into existence, they develop. And the doctrine develops when necessary to protect the message, the tradition, against novel attacks. Again, Blessed John Henry Newman, in his book, says, no doctrine is defined till it is violated. In other words, you have the apostles and everybody's got the same message, there's no problem. You don't need to define doctrine. But if somebody says, you know, Jesus Christ, I believe he was God, and therefore he must not have suffered, because God cannot suffer. That's a novel statement, and immediately the bishops of the church have to rally around to say, no, that's not right, that's not the message. You're altering the message. And they develop doctrine, and they state the doctrine. St. Ignatius of Antioch in their epistles, we'll find out he very firmly rebukes those who say that Christ did not suffer. But that's the development of doctrine. Number 4, the Bishop of Rome. The role of the Bishop of Rome. The Pope is the Bishop of Rome. Pope is a courtesy title that's kind of a nickname. The Pope really held his office by virtue of being the successor of St. Peter as the Bishop of Rome. That's the most important thing. And we will see that from the earliest times, the Bishop of Rome exercises authority to teach, to discipline, and to safeguard the traditions. And as we go through, we'll see time and again where the role of the Bishop of Rome is to do those things. And we'll see bishops of Rome who are not very good people. They're not very smart, they're not very wise, not very prudent. But time and again, nonetheless, they intervene to protect the tradition, protect the message. And finally, the last major theme is the church in crisis. Nowadays, people think, oh, the Catholic Church is in really bad shape. Particularly among traditional-minded Catholics, think this is terrible, we're falling apart. You hadn't seen nothing yet. We are living in a golden age compared to what they went through, the church has gone through throughout its history. And we'll encounter a lot of those things, a lot of those terrible crises. And part of this is that the church is always under attack. One of my favorite quotes is from G.K. Chesterton. In his book, The Everlasting Man, he says, "And there shone on the early Christians in that dark hour a light that has never been darkened, the halo of hatred around the Church of God." And what he's talking about there is that the Church of God has always been encircled by a halo of hatred. People react strongly to the Catholic Church, and they always have from day one. It scandalizes them, it angers them, and it is hated like nothing else. And that is true all the way down to the present time. I think it was Chesterton who said that very few people who know anything about religion are neutral about the Catholic Church. You're either drawn to it or repelled by it. People have very strong feelings about it. And those who are repelled by it, many people rise to the level of hatred. And you can see that in the new atheist, Christopher Hitchin, God is Not Good, in the book. There are many books like that about how terrible the Catholic Church is. People hate the Catholic Church, and it's a sign. It's a sign of what the Catholic Church is. And I think I've said this before. There are lots of Protestant denominations: Presbyterians, Lutherans, Methodists. I have lots of friends in those places. There are a lot of people in those who love the Lord and are far holier than I will ever be. But nobody hates the Methodists. I mean, you don't the Methodist Church, nobody. I mean, a lot of people don't think about them, and they're not attracted to them or repelled by them. So the Catholic Church is really in a different classification when it comes to this kind of thing. And you'll see it if you open your newspaper. You'll see how Catholics are hated. And it has happened from the very beginning. And it's another major theme of this course. So we'll be talking about history, the tradition, the development of doctrine, the role of the Bishop of Rome, and the church in crisis. Crisis is normal, and it's especially normal after a council. We'll find that out too. We had the Second Vatican Council, 40 years ago, and everybody thinks, well, there's a lot of turmoil. Again, you haven't seen anything yet. After councils, you can go for 100 years with enormous turmoil when you think things have been settled. So that's the major themes.